Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Darren, thank you. We take you live to Brussels now, where the news conference at the end of the fourth monthly round of talks is now underway. Speaking Britain's Secretary for exiting the EU, David Davis.
It built on a hugely significant work that has gone on across government over the last year, that's seen us publish 14 papers covering technical negotiation detail and the United Kingdom vision for the future relationship, the Article 50 letter and 2 crucial white papers. So this week, my negotiating team came to Brussels armed with detailed thinking that underpins the proposal set out by the Prime Minister. And while inevitably this requires further discussion, I believe that thanks to the constructive and determined manner in which both sides have conducted these negotiations, we're making decisive steps forward. After 4 rounds, when I look across the full range of issues to do with our withdrawal from the EU, I'm clear we've made considerable progress on the issues that matter: increasing certainty for citizens and businesses, providing reassurance to our EU partners in regards to our mutual financial obligations, and agreeing to some of the key principles in relation to issues arising for Northern Ireland and Ireland. Now, I make no secret of wanting to talk about the future and the importance of this to business and citizens in both the European Union and the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister's speech sets out the scale of our ambition here, as well as a proposal for a simple, clear, time-limited period of implementation. This period, based on current terms, will ensure people, businesses and public services only have to plan for one set of changes. I believe this should be quick to agree once Michel has a mandate to explore it with us. As the Prime Minister said last week, our shared future can only be founded on partnership, friendship and, most importantly, trust. This is what discussions this week have been about, which brings me to the detail of our discussions. On citizens' rights, we have made real progress on issues which will enable citizens on both sides to continue to live their lives broadly as they do now. We will publish an updated table later today which shows many areas of agreement. So I'm pleased to report that we've agreed most aspects of social security coordination, building on the progress in the last round, which I told you about last time. The United Kingdom thinks that in some cases we must go beyond the strict requirements of current European Union law in order to protect citizens. For example, we have offered the European Union guaranteed rights of return for settled EU citizens in the UK in return for onward movement rights for onward movement for UK nationals who currently live within the 27. And I look forward to the response of the Commission to this offer once they've consulted with the Member States. But we must also acknowledge that a major question remains open between us. It relates to the enforcement of citizens' rights after we leave the European Union. The UK has been clear that as a third country outside of the European Union, it would not be right for this role to be performed by the European Court of Justice. But we have listened to the concerns that have been raised, and as a direct result of hearing those concerns, the United Kingdom is committed to incorporating the final withdrawal agreement fully into UK law, direct effect, if you like. We also recognise the need to ensure consistent interpretation of European Union law concepts. We've not agreed the right mechanism for doing this yet, but discussions this week have again been productive. And we provided further reassurance on how European Union citizens will be able to apply for a new status once we leave. And we know those that are already holding permanent residency documents should not have to go through the full process. So we presented early thinking on detailed processes and plans on how we might ensure this does not happen. It's all about providing certainty, clarity, stability for European Union citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the 27. And it represents pragmatic compromises to our shared challenge of ending anxiety for those citizens. The shape of that deal is becoming clearer. We need to continue to work to address this in the interests of citizens on both sides. In her recent speech, the Prime Minister reassured our European partners they'll not need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current EU budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. The UK has explained this reassurance in detail to the Commission. The Prime Minister also made clear that the UK will honour its commitments made during the period of our membership. We're not yet at the stage of specifying exactly what these commitments are. That will need to come later. Nevertheless, our negotiating teams have held very constructive discussions this week on detailed technical issues relating to that. This work is necessary so that when the time comes, we'll be able to reach a political agreement, and discussions will continue. On the issues that arise from the UK's withdrawal from the EU in relation to Northern Ireland and Ireland, we have had a constructive discussion and made progress in some areas. Both sides recognise that the unique situation and the special circumstances on the island of Ireland must fully inform any solutions. We welcome the EU's recent Guiding Principles paper, which reaffirms the high degree of alignment between us on this vital strand. Specifically this week, we have begun drafting joint principles on preserving the common travel area and associated rights. We have both agreed that the Good Friday Agreement citizenship rights must be upheld, and we're working together on how this commitment is best codified. The joint work we agreed in the August negotiating round on preserving the North-South cooperation strand is moving along at pace. We're addressing complex issues here, but both are resolved to finding imaginative solutions. We owe it to the people of Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland to see these commitments through. We remain firmly committed to making as much progress as possible on those issues that are related to our withdrawal from the EU institutions and must be resolved before our departure from the European Union. I'm encouraged by the progress we've made this week on issues relating to Euratom. The EU welcomed our clear statement. We will maintain the same standards in our future nuclear safeguards regime, which will be run by our existing nuclear regulator, the Office for Nuclear Regulation. We're now close to reaching agreement on the vast majority of issues set out in our position papers on this issue. Of course, we want to have a close and effective relationship with Euratom in the future, and the best way to secure that is to press on with discussions on the details of this new partnership. On a number of other issues, goods, union and member state procedures, privileges and immunities, ongoing confidentiality obligations, we have had constructive discussion on technical issues and in some areas reached agreement on the core issues. At the beginning of the week, I mentioned the UK's real and ongoing commitment to our European friends and allies. Our commitment to that ideal has been clear in these negotiations on those issues which relate to our departure from the institutions. As I said at the start, this round was a vital one. We made important progress and capitalised on the momentum created by the Prime Minister's speech. We're working quickly through a number of complex issues, yet there remain some points where further discussion and pragmatism will be required to reach agreement. It's true that there are differences of opinion, but with the continued diligence and creativity of our teams, I am confident we can resolve these. While the UK's departure from the European Union is inevitably a complex process, it's in all our interests for these negotiations to succeed. We must never forget the bigger picture. Britain wants to be the European Union's strongest friend and partner. We want us both to thrive side by side. I leave Brussels optimistic about this future, and I look forward to continuing the negotiations. Thank you. Michel.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon to all of you. The Prime Minister's speech in France has created a new dynamic in our negotiations, and we have felt this during the negotiations this week, as David just said. On Monday, I said that we needed a moment of clarity. David and I, as well as our teams, worked well together. I want to thank both teams for their dedication, their professionalism, and their expertise. We managed to create clarity on some points. On others, however, more work remains to be done, and we are not there yet. But we will keep working in a constructive spirit until we reach a deal on the essential principles of the UK's orderly withdrawals. Allow me also on my side to briefly outline what was agreed this week and what more needs to be done. On citizen rights, our priority, the UK has agreed to give direct effect to the withdrawal agreement. This is very important. It will give the assurance to our citizens that they will be able to invoke their rights as defined by the withdrawal agreement before UK courts. We agreed to guarantee for the citizens concerned that the UK will apply EU law concepts in a manner that is consistent with EU law after Brexit. But we failed to agree that the European Court of Justice must play an indispensable role in ensuring this consistency. This is a stumbling block for the EU. There are others. Number one, a big gap remains between our positions on family reunification. We want existing rights to continue for the citizens concerned. Number two, the export of social security benefits also remains to be discussed. And number three, citizens need simplified administrative procedures. The UK stated its intention to put in place a streamlined system. We are looking, David, forward to hearing the details about this new system. On the financial settlement, an expert group held detailed talks on technical aspects, and those talks were useful. Prime Minister May said two things in Florence. First, that no member state should pay more and no member state should receive less because of Brexit. Second, that the UK will honour commitments taken during its membership. This week, the UK negotiating team made clear that applying the first principle would be limited to 2019 and 2020. And the UK explained also that it is not in a position yet to identify its commitments taken during membership. For the EU, the only way to reach sufficient progress is that all commitments undertaken at 28 are honoured at 28. On Ireland, we had once again, a constructive discussion, and we made progress in some areas. As David just said, both the EU and the UK recognise that Ireland is in a unique situation. Any solution will need to be fully informed by the special circumstances on the island of Ireland. As I mentioned several times, such solutions must respect both the integrity of the single market and the Union's legal order and the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts. We also confirmed our commitments towards maintaining the common travel area and started drafting common principles. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a constructive week, yes, but we are not yet there in terms of achieving sufficient progress. Further work is needed in the coming weeks and coming months. In 3 weeks from now, the October European Council will be an opportunity for me to take stock of the negotiations with the President Juncker and the President Tusk and the 27 heads of states or government. I also look forward next week to the European Parliament's resolution, which is important. I hope that the new dynamic created by Prime Minister May's speech in Florence will continue to inform our work. Let's leave it here. We will pick up in the week of the 9th of October, where we left off this week. And I want to thank you for your attention too.
Thank you very much. We have time now for 4 questions. And I will start with Ben.
Thank you very much. Ben Wright from BBC. Ben Wright from BBC. Can you hear me now? Thank you very much. Ben Wright from the BBC. 2 questions, if I may. David Davis, your tone today is clearly more optimistic. There's a warmer atmosphere in here. But there are obviously big stumbling blocks, in particular the role of the ECJ enforcing citizens' rights and the massive issue of money. The European Union clearly want commitments for more. Do you honestly feel that this is a proper negotiation, or are you simply trying to pass a series of tests the EU is setting you? Monsieur Barnier, if I may, could you define more clearly for us, please, the phrase sufficient progress? It's very vague. And couldn't it be argued that it's your very narrow interpretation of the negotiating mandate that is holding these talks back?
Yes. Sometimes the questions make me laugh. Of course, it's a proper negotiation. We're here every round with 100 officials. And to take one example today, I mean, later on today we'll be publishing an updated table of progress on citizens' rights that shows the direct outcome of those negotiations. Now, if you look at them, you'll see most of them are now green, as they term it, and it's an agreement between us. And most of them, all of them, help all or part of the 3 million European Union citizens and the 1 million United Kingdom citizens, or both. And so it's to their advantage. The same thing is true of Northern Ireland, where we've made real progress. There's not been a one-way process at all. And broadly thanks to the Prime Minister's speech last week, we've made tangible progress in other areas. And I hope we'll see in the future, for example, very significant progress on the question of the implementation period. That will come in due course. But again, that's not a one-way process.
Les citoyens britanniques
to leave the European Union. That was their sovereign decision. The United Kingdom government confirmed that they wished to leave the customs union and the internal market. Those are decisions which are heavy with consequences. They're serious decisions. And as David said earlier on, there are complicated consequences in all sorts of areas: human, social, legal, financial, economic, technical. So you shouldn't be surprised. You shouldn't be surprised that these rounds, which are all useful, some of them have more stumbling blocks, some of them have disappointments, and some of them take steps forward, and we've had important clarifications this week. But you shouldn't be surprised that this takes time, the necessary time. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, remember that this is not the usual kind of negotiation for the European Commission. We don't have a text or a directive to defend. I'm the negotiator here in the Commission, and I have the trust of 27 governments, heads of state or government, and of the European Parliament. And my job is simply to make sure that we find the ways and means for an orderly withdrawal. That is, an agreement with the United Kingdom at the point where they leave, which is much better than leaving without an agreement, and that we do it by protecting the interests of the 27 and that we make sure that the European taxpayer doesn't have to carry the burden of decisions taken by the citizens of the United Kingdom, and making sure that we preserve the integrity of the internal market and the non-negotiable integrity of the autonomy of decision-making amongst the 27 in deciding their own destiny. So once again, as David said, and as I have said myself, I think that it's positive that Theresa May's speech made it possible to unblock the situation to some extent and give a new dynamic to the situation. But we're far from being at a stage, and it will take weeks or maybe even months, where we'll be able to say, yes, OK, there's been sufficient progress on the principles of this orderly withdrawal.
OK. Bruno.
Bruno Waterfield, Times of London. First, for Mr. Davis, the arrangements for European nationals living in Britain, direct effect of the withdrawal treaty, won't be able to be amended by Parliament, that European law concepts will continue to apply and be visible through that in the UK. Of course, it sounds awfully like the European Communities Act 1972. Can you explain to us why it won't be? We see the figures for liabilities in the 2016 budget, an all-time high, 238.8 billion. Can you tell us which part of those commitments Britain will honour? Britain said it would honour those commitments, and which part it won't. Mr Barnier, on October the 9th, we're hearing that Britain will make new concrete proposals on these areas to you. If they go some way to addressing your concerns, would you ask the European Council on the 19th of October to adjust your mandate in order to be able to get deep into the nitty-gritty of a transition arrangement?
Thank you, Bruno. It doesn't look anything like the 1972 Act to me. Let's say what it is. We have been discussing this, you might imagine this is central, this issue of the rights of European Union citizens in the UK. And we accept, and have done from the start, that there is a need for certainty for them. And that's what we are aiming to produce, without allowing the European Court of Justice to make rulings within and on cases in the UK. And this is the compromise we are working towards. It's not unusual. There are plenty of arrangements where we have treaties that confine what the United Kingdom do, very specific, with very real aims. And that's what we're doing here. As for the money, we're not doing the negotiation standing here. Yeah.
I answered earlier on about sufficient progress. I mean, we could go into the details, but if you read the papers and the position papers that have been made public with full transparency by the Commission and by my team, I think you can see. I mean, you can see what we expect. It's all about sustainable protection of citizens' rights in time, coherent interpretation of those rights on both sides, and the financial settlement. We're asking for the fact that the commitments entered into by 28 be honoured by 28, no more nor less. And on Ireland, we're making progress. I mean, as soon as possible, as soon as, and I take my responsibilities as a negotiator seriously, as soon as I can say that we're there, in that first sequence, underpinning the orderly withdrawal, then as soon as possible, I shall recommend to the European Council that we start the second stage in the sequence, which would then be addressing the request that the UK government put forward through this Theresa May for the first time. I mean, David had mentioned it. But this transition period, I mean, the 27 are not surprised by that request from the United Kingdom for a transition period. I have the basic document, which is my mandate, and which does indeed describe the conditions under which we would be able to discuss in good time, and I hope that that won't be in a long time, but discuss a transition period. And if you read that document, because it is extremely specific and extremely precise, I wasn't surprised by this request from the United Kingdom side. But as I said, in order to get to that second stage, which may well have a link with the orderly withdrawal, but we're still under Article 50, and that means that the drafting of a treaty organising the withdrawal of the United Kingdom. As I said, I have a clear mandate which I have to respect. That orderly withdrawal includes a certain number of separation issues. We've just discussed some of them. And amongst them is the possibility of a transition phase. As soon as I can deem that there's real progress and report back to those who gave me the mandate, I shall do so. And then we would be able speedily to move on to the second stage in the sequence.
Next on my list is Simon.
Thanks, Simon Taylor from MLEX. Question for Mr. Barnier. Mr. Davis said on Monday that the financial settlement could only properly be resolved at a later stage when the future relationship was clarified. Have you come round to his point of view, or if not, then surely the chances of moving forward on this discussion are still blocked?
D'abord, sur le fond.
On the substance, first of all, thanks to those two sentences which I deemed constructive, as I said, very soon afterwards, that the sentences spoken by the Prime Minister in Florence. Theresa May, it helps us clarify things. It's very important that the Prime Minister says, and it's been specified that it's 2019-2020, of course, but that the member states of the Union will not have to pay more or receive less. That's very useful. But if you're only talking about 2 years, that's not the end, is it? The second sentence is also important, of course, though. That is recognising that the commitments entered into by the United Kingdom during the period where they were a member of the Union, up to the time of their withdrawal, all those commitments will be honoured, or taken together in a pooled fashion, if you will have to be respected and honoured by 28. And I hope that we can clarify that point moving forward, and I hope we can get a clear undertaking on that point, which is the translation of what I've been calling sufficient progress on that subject, which is indissociable from the other two subjects, the rights of citizens and the question of Ireland. As I said, they're a whole, they're indissociable. As to the rest, being very frank, objectively, I see no logical and coherent link between a discussion that we will have and open as soon as possible, and which must be ambitious about the future, what I've been calling the new partnership between the United Kingdom and the European Union in many areas: trade, security and defence, fighting terrorism, but perhaps other areas as well. That is a discussion for the future. There's no link. There is no possible link, the way we see it, no possible link between that discussion and a discussion about separating the separation issues and the commitments entered into in the past.
Thanks, Alexander. I was afraid that you are giving the floor only to British journalists. Gary Gotter from Your Active in Brussels. My question is on citizens, but it's a little bit on the side. I mean, after the orderly Brexit, will the UK be free to impose visas to, let's say, Polish, Bulgarian, Romanian citizens, perhaps a couple of other countries as well, or a commitment not to do so would be part of the deal. And since I don't think I will be able to ask a follow-up question, if this is not part of the discussions, why? Because the interests of several countries are very seriously concerned.
Well, yes, I mean, we will. I mean, your strict question, will we be free to? Yes, we will be no longer a member of the European Union. We'll be free to operate our migration policy as we see fit. As I've said before, that does not mean that people from European Union countries will not be able to come to Britain and work in Britain, but we'll have that freedom.
The question was really for Davis rather than for David rather than for me, wasn't it? We're discussing objectively all the subjects where some uncertainty is created in general terms. And we've taken all these subjects, and I think David talked about the 14 documents that the UK has published, and we've published 14 documents, on all sorts of subjects, wherever there's uncertainty. And the first priority is, of course, citizens, the people. We want to make their rights secure, reciprocally, on the basis of non-discrimination, on the basis of continuity of rights. All those rights acquired up to Brexit, and rights acquired by families, that's very important as well. And that security should be there for their whole life. And we're talking about everything acquired up to the point of Brexit. On the 29th of March, or 30th of March of 2019 at midnight, the United Kingdom becomes a third country. And that applies in every area. I mean, it just becomes a third country. And after that, as you know, and we have this objective to work together on a partnership which will be our future relationship, which I hope will be a very strong partnership in many, many areas. But that's a discussion, and we can discuss migration, immigration, the conditions on both sides. But that is a subject which relates to the future of our relationship with a country which has become a third country. It's a completely different legal situation.
Much. This concludes our press conference, and midday will start in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, that was the news conference there by the two main negotiators in Britain's Brexit talks, Michel Barnier and David Davis. And just to sum up, really the most important thing coming out of it was that Michel Barnier said that there had not been sufficient progress made for the European Union to agree, talking about the future relationship. He still wanted progress in the area of Britain's divorce bill and also on some of the questions of citizens' rights, although it should also be said that David Davis stuck a very positive note, saying that a lot of progress had been made, and certainly Michel Barnier did say that in a number of areas he felt there was progress. He said it could be weeks or months before there was agreement that sufficient progress had been made to move on to stage 2. Well, let's go straight for reaction now to the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Simon Coveney, who's been listening to that and joins us from Dublin. Well, first of all, thank you for waiting and listening to that. I'm sure you'll agree, fairly important. Are you disappointed, or do you agree that things are not yet ready to move on to the next phase of negotiations with Britain?
Well, I don't think that's a big surprise. I certainly think the Prime Minister's speech last week has changed the tone of the negotiations. The feedback we're getting from the negotiations this week was that it was very businesslike and that real progress is being made in some areas. So if you take, for example, what's called the common travel area between Ireland and Britain, This is something that's hugely important for British citizens in Ireland and Irish citizens in the UK, ensuring that regardless of Brexit, they will be able to continue to move and live in each other's countries, access social welfare, education, healthcare, pensions. They can vote in each other's elections for the most part. And that relationship that was there before either country joined the European Union would be maintained into the future. There seems to be significant progress on that issue. But there are other Irish issues where we feel there isn't sufficient progress to allow us move on to future relationships and trade and transition arrangements and so on. That's no surprise. You know, I think the Irish government and indeed the Barnier task force has been very consistent on this. You've heard obviously about citizens' rights issues and about financial settlement issues, but also on the Irish issues, which is the third pillar, if you like, of the phase one of negotiations that needs progress before we move on to phase two in parallel. So no one's expecting that these three issues will be resolved in full before we move on to phase two, but there certainly needs to be more clarity and more progress. So, for example, on the Irish border issues, you know, while the British government has been saying many things that are very positive in terms of what they want to achieve, what they haven't done is being convincing in terms of how we're actually going to achieve them. So, you know, if Britain is determined to leave, for example, the customs union, then when you move from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, you're moving from one customs jurisdiction into another. How then do you avoid customs checks? And we have made it very clear that not only do we want to see no physical infrastructure on the border, which the British government agrees with and the Barnier task force is insisting upon, but we don't want to see any border infrastructure at all that actually prevents the normalisation of trade and of, you know, movement of goods and services on the island of Ireland, which is very much linked to a peace process and to a normalisation on the island of Ireland. So these are complex issues. I think we're making some progress. Certainly, I think the aspirations that have been outlined by the UK side we agree with. But what we don't have is a political understanding as to how we're actually going to achieve that within these negotiations. And I think we need more progress on that before we can move on to broader trade issues. And
well, I mean,
everybody knows that the trade issues are linked to the Irish issues.
I understand that, but at the same time, the British government would say, look, we're now proposing this transition period or this implementation period, which would pretty much keep things the same on the Irish border. So that, if you like, has bought time and moved to a certain extent in the direction that the Irish government would like things to go. So isn't the logical thing to really start looking at the practicalities now so that those things can be agreed with in the future, rather than, as it sounded a little bit there, Mr. Barnier sort of basically rattling the tin and saying until we get every last cent out of the British, we're not going to move forward?
Well, I think that's a very unfair depiction, if you don't mind my saying, of the approach of the EU side. That I mean, we've been very consistent.
He did
from
say
the outset
we want everything to continue at 28, which basically was saying everything that Britain's agreed they should go on paying for, and it appeared to be indefinitely.
No, but let's just be clear. We're not even negotiating the transition arrangement yet, or the length of time that it's going to take, or the future trading relationship. I know Britain wants to discuss those things, and obviously there are discussions and debates around those issues, particularly in Britain. But in terms of the formal negotiations between the UK side and the Barnier task force, both sides, including the UK, agreed that in phase one we would negotiate the issues that I've referred to, and there would need to be sufficient progress on those issues to then move on to the second phase in parallel. So, you know, Ireland, and I don't think anybody else is saying that all of the issues have to be resolved in full. Some of them are connected to the future trading arrangements. Obviously, the border issues on the island of Ireland are very much connected with the future trading arrangements between Britain and the EU as a whole, as well as between Britain and Ireland. But I think there needs to be more clarity in terms of understanding. For example, if the trade arrangements break down in the future, which hopefully they won't, how do we protect the peace process? How do we ensure that Northern Ireland doesn't go backwards 10 years, or 20 years for that matter? So, there are genuine issues here. Britain has made a decision to leave the European Union, but the consequences of that decision are really significant for many of your neighbours, as well as Britain itself. And we're teasing through those issues, and some of the issues need more clarity before we move on to where I think the British government want to be, which is talking about future trade relationships and opportunities and a transition to get us there and so on. All of that is necessary, and we're looking forward to that negotiation. I mean, Ireland's trade relationship east-west with Britain is a €65 billion trade relationship. 200,000 people are directly employed in Ireland linked to that trading relationship. So we want to talk about it, and we want to move on to phase 2. But that doesn't mean that we avoid making the difficult political decisions in relation to phase 1, which are necessary to allow us to do that credibly.
Yeah,
and that's our position, and we are absolutely square behind the Barnier task force on that.
Yeah, but the problem with that approach is you could end up driving both of us off the cliff edge. If there isn't an agreement by this time next year, because the European Parliament says it wants to ratify it and all the rest of it, there will be the cliff edge. There will be all those things on the border which you don't want. And therefore, standing on dignity, if you like, at this stage, preventing the British from moving forward into areas which they want, increases the risk of a cliff edge, which is, cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah. No, but let's just be clear. It's the EU side that has been consistent here. The British side agreed to the approach that is currently being adopted. The EU task force simply wants to implement that.
It wasn't
what
it proposed. It wasn't what the British proposed. It has complied with it. But what I'm saying is now, if too much emphasis is placed on that, time is simply going to run out.
No, let's not rewrite history here. Okay? It was agreed between both parties that these negotiations would happen in a phased process. There would be a phase 1 and a phase 2. The EU side is remaining consistent on that.
Just to get history absolutely correct, that was not Britain's preferred position. They complied with it, but it was not. They agreed to it, I accept, but it wasn't the agreed proposal.
Yes,
from Britain.
They agreed to it. Okay, they agreed to it, and we are simply looking to follow through on what was agreed. So I understand how difficult the political debate on these issues are in the UK. I've spent much of my life living in the United Kingdom. A lot of my family are still very English and live in England and are very much part of this debate in the UK. This is an evolving and difficult debate that divides families and political parties in the UK. I get that, and we need to be sensitive to it. But at the same time, we also have to stick with what was agreed at the start in terms of maintaining the credibility of these negotiations. And we need to get to a point whereby there is sufficient progress, not complete agreement, on the phase 1 issues. And that will allow us then to move on and hopefully build some trust on the back of those agreements to be able to get a deal on transition and trade and future relationships and so on, which are proving now to be much more complicated than I think anybody was predicting when the vote was taken in Britain 15 months ago. So Ireland wants to maintain a close relationship with Britain. That's in our interests. We want Britain to be part of Europe, even though Britain is leaving the European Union. But we do also need to protect our own interests here. We have a peace process which is hugely important on the island of Ireland, which is challenged already without Brexit adding extra pressure. We have a border issue on the island of Ireland which we simply cannot allow to undermine and damage normal life on the island of Ireland, and everyone has a responsibility towards doing that, and that is simply what we're asking for here, which I don't think is unreasonable.
Yeah, but my point is that cliff edge, whatever it means for the United Kingdom, as I see it, cliff edge would be the worst option for the Irish as well.
Oh, I mean, a cliff edge is a disaster, and for Ireland. I mean, we have an interwoven economy with Britain. We have had for many years. I'm a former agricultural minister in Ireland, and so I know that. As I said, it's a 1.3 billion euro trade relationship every single week that involves hundreds of thousands of people in terms of employment. So the Irish and British relationship is a hugely important to us, but our membership of the European Union and the single market and all of the positives that it brings to Ireland is also very important for us. So we can't be making decisions on the basis of threats of a potential cliff edge. We need to be mature enough as senior policymakers and negotiators to be able to stick to an agreed negotiating agenda and structure and find our way through here. And I think it's important to say this because it's true, I think, the negotiations this week in terms of tone and in terms of approach has been more constructive from what I'm hearing than any of the previous negotiations between the two teams. I think that's welcome, and I think we need to build on that now. But I think Ireland would be very foolish if we were to essentially skip making the difficult and important political decisions and compromises that are needed on the Irish issues, whether that's protecting the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, or whether it's the border issues,
Michael Coveney,
or the common
I'm
travel
afraid
area.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That is all from All Out Politics for today. Please join us again tomorrow.
British ministers had been hoping Mrs May's speech in Florence last Friday would break the deadlock in the Brexit talks and enable them to move to the second phase, covering Britain's future relationship with the EU, including a free trade deal. The latest round of Brexit talks wrapped up a short time ago in Brussels, with the Brexit Secretary David Davis giving his customary press conference alongside EU negotiator Michel Barnier.
At the beginning of the week, I mentioned the UK's real and ongoing commitment to our European friends and allies. Our commitment to that ideal has been clear in these negotiations on those issues which relate to our departure from the institutions. As I said at the start, this round was a vital one. We made important progress and capitalised on the momentum created by the Prime Minister's speech. We're working quickly through a number of complex issues, yet there remain some points where further discussion and pragmatism will be required to reach agreement. It's true that there are differences of opinion, but with the continued diligence and creativity of our teams, I am confident we can resolve these.
On Monday, I said that we needed a moment of clarity. David and I, as well as our teams, worked well together. I want to thank both teams for their dedication, their professionalism, and their expertise. We managed to create clarity on some points. On others, however, more work remains to be done, and we are not there yet.
Michel Barnier there. Joining us now from Brussels is our political correspondent, Ben Wright. Ben, I heard the questions that you put to the two gentlemen in the press conference, and it seemed in their response to you that although the tone may have changed, it may feel a little warmer in terms of these negotiations, nothing substantial has actually happened.
I think that's probably right, Joe. And Michel Barnier went on to say that there remain big gaps between the two sides on some pretty fundamental issues. I mean, we're now all quite familiar with the three key questions they are trying to resolve in this first round of talks: the rights of EU citizens in the UK, keeping the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and Britain's financial liabilities, the money, the settlement that Britain is being asked to pay by the EU. And I think some progress, it seems, on those fronts. The UK's promised to put the rights of EU citizens into a treaty that will be enshrined in UK law, received a pretty warm welcome from Michel Barnier, and that was something first mentioned by Theresa May in her speech in Florence, of course. But Michel Barnier also clear the EU wants the European Court of Justice to be the final arbiter, the backstop of those rights, and that seems to be a red line still for the UK. So a big disagreement on the money question too. Welcome here in Brussels by Michel Barnier that the UK is now talking about its financial commitments, and 20 billion or so, which is the budget contribution for the next couple of years, the 2 years after we've left, will be met. But it's clear that the EU want much more detail on broader liabilities, and they want that spelt out now before that second phase of talks can begin, and I think he was quite clear about that.
Right, so sufficient progress in his mind, Michel Barnier, hasn't been met yet and could still be weeks or months away. But it does feel as if the Florence speech somehow has unlocked something in Brussels, doesn't it?
Definitely, and I think, clearly it has helped change the mood. I think perhaps there was a feeling here that the UK was being unhelpfully belligerent and a bit antagonistic, and I think the feeling on the EU side of the table was that the UK didn't quite get it and they weren't they weren't doing this seriously enough, and they didn't understand the fact that these three issues needed to be resolved before that second phase can begin. So I think there's been a sort of both sides have sort of just got serious about this, and maybe it's taken a few months to figure out the dynamics at play here. But it certainly seems that it's been a more productive round of talks than anything we've seen so far.
Ben Wright in Brussels, thank you very much. Well, joining us now are Lucy Thomas, who's Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe and is now Head of Brexit Advice at the PR firm Edelman, and Henry Newman, the Director of Open Europe. Welcome to both of you. So, have you finally got it, Henry Newman? Is this the case that Britain has finally woken up to the fact that they do need to be a little more open-minded and a little more emollient if they're going to get something back?
I think what we saw in the Prime Minister's speech at Florence was a sort of grown-up consensus. She changed her tone. She puts quite a lot of things on the table. But my concern is I don't think Europe is getting it. I think that Mr Barnier is pretending that this is some sort of technical exercise to get to an assessment of whether we made sufficient progress. But reality is he's basically doing this, putting his finger in the air, making a political judgment. And I think if you take a reasonable view of what the UK have proposed, they've put quite a lot on the table now. It's time to move on and start talking about the future.
Right. I mean, isn't that the case? The money's there now. In the terms that the figures have been put on the table, it's time to just negotiate a final figure. There's obviously goodwill on both sides in terms of settling the EU citizens question. They need to sort out the final arbiter, of course, who is going to ensure those rights. And actually, when it comes to the border in Northern Ireland, that cannot be sorted until you can look at a free trade deal. So isn't Henry Newman right? EU is blocking this.
I think ultimately it's about leverage, and both sides are looking at what cards do we have on our side. For the UK, it's trade and security, broadly speaking. For the EU, it's the ability to move on to the second stage. But they also want to make sure that there is enough in that budget pot. And for the UK to say we're going to pay the bare minimum, which is to cover our liabilities for the 2 years, 2019-2020, that is not enough for the EU.
Well, they have said more than that, I think.
And would they? And how much more should they pay? And would that push the talks further along?
I think they said two things. I think they said that during the current budgetary period, no country will have to pay more or receive less. But they've also said that they'll meet their obligations from the past. That's sort of two separate commitments. I mean, I think the key is both sides here have a profound moral duty, right? The UK is exercising a democratic decision that is allowed in the treaties. Right, and I think that decision has to be respected, and the EU has a duty to come to the table seriously and take these negotiations properly.
Isn't the problem, though, as you said, a political one, that actually here in the UK, Theresa May's position is weaker than it was before the election, and they recognise that in Brussels, that there is a difference of opinion that has been playing out here on the political stage with Boris Johnson's 4,000-word opus on what he thinks should happen in these Brexit negotiations. Philip Hammond has a slightly different view and would like to see us more closely aligned to the single market. That's what makes it difficult.
I don't think so. I think that you've got disagreement in the cabinet, you've got disagreement in politics. This is a very profound issue which we should all be debating and discussing. But actually, the government, the Conservative Party, are pretty united around the Lancaster House speech position, which stayed the same at Florence. We'll be leaving the single market, we'll be leaving the customs union. The new bit is we'll have a transition, which is broadly a standstill for 2 years.
Do you think it's too rigid? The problem for Michel Barnier is he is dictated to by the Commission and the 27 other member states, and that rigid formula is now becoming a barrier.
Well, this was always going to be the way it was going to be, and for the likes of me, one of the reasons I thought leaving was a really bad idea, because there are 27 countries on that side, all being negotiated through this one-person Barnier. So it means he doesn't have flexibility. The 27 set him a mandate at the beginning of the process and said, here you go away, this is what you need to do on our behalf. And so we can't pick off different countries, we can't go over their heads. He has to be flexible. And I think the point on top of the bill is this ECJ point. For the EU and for Barnier, they want there to be oversight of the European Court of Justice because, frankly, they don't trust us.
Right. I mean,
well, I think that's slightly. I think agree that is a concern on the continent, but I think anybody with any experience of the UK court system would find it hard to recognise a view that they're somehow biased in a political direction. I think our courts are more than capable of defending citizens' rights, and the commitment today from the government to put the withdrawal treaty into domestic law is exactly the right one.
And that's a move. That is a guarantee, if you like, isn't it, to EU citizens to write it in law. You can understand why people would be nervous about their future status because governments come and go. So That guarantee, should that not be enough now?
Well, I think on paper perhaps, but if you look at what Barnier has said before, he raised, in his speech the day before Theresa May's speech, he raised the fact that the UK government had ignored the courts on one of these issues. So he is being very political. He's a long-standing politician who wants to play tactics with this.
The classic thing when I listen to it, and I'm not making a course here, you just argued why the UK courts should be trusted and they're unbiased, which I think they are, and I think they're very good. Equally, the ECJ has a very strong reputation too as being one of the gold standard of legal decision-making in the world. So the problem is the argument that you've used why it should be the UK court has exactly a flip point as why it should be a European court, and that's the problem with this negotiation. We are used to a political party in power making a decision and an opposition who object to it and can only touch around the edges. Here we're in a true negotiation of the most difficult type, and what we're seeing, you know, and the debate that went before the Brexit vote was, you know, we wouldn't have gone into this in the first place, so we should get out of it. But marriage and divorce are not the same things. And this is going to be, as we're seeing already, a very, very difficult divorce negotiation. We just have to cross our fingers Britain gets what it wants. We work together to try and make sure that our economy stays stable and we thrive on the back end of it. But I think it's going to be tough.
And on the basis of that, do you think the transition period of 2 years or something around that sort of point is about right in order to help that transition through?
Yeah, I've long felt that a transition was pretty inevitable. I think the idea of keeping things where they are is a good thing. It'll sort of reassure businesses, it'll reassure people who voted for Remain, and it'll mean, as Davis said, there's only one sort of change that business has to make rather than two, rather than one into a transition period and one out of a transition period.
But there would still be a cliff edge.
Well, I mean, there will be a change in regulatory landscape, and that's what we haven't yet answered. That's what the Cabinet needs to determine.
Right, and of course that still, as you say, has yet to be worked out. I mean, if you are looking at where the government has gone now in terms of that transition, would you accept that they've sort of bought Labour's proposal on this?
No, I don't. I think Labour's position is unclear, actually. And I tried to challenge Keir Starmer at an event that Open Europe held at party conference on this. They are saying that they want to be in the single market. Well, what does that mean? How are you in the single market if you're not in the EU itself or in the European Economic Area? I don't know, and I don't think they know.
Right, and do you accept that Labour's trying to face both ways on this? And they could argue that in opposition, that's what you do. We can promise Leavers that we're doing what they wanted, and the same with Remainers. I mean, they're even now talking about a second referendum again.
I think the main problem Labour faces is the broad spectrum of opinion that exists within it, both within MPs and constituencies. A majority of their constituencies voted to leave in the referendum, but a majority of their voters voted to remain. So they have this real challenge, and you've got people like Sadiq Khan, as you say, calling for the possibility of a second referendum, and then you have those more like John McDonnell and Corbyn himself, who think that single market membership is incompatible with the kind of nationalisation they want to carry out, which in fact isn't correct. And I think they need to understand what is possible within the single market. But nevertheless, that there is that broad spectrum to really come to a position on.
Finally, Liam Fox has launched this new think tank looking at free trade. He obviously hasn't got much to do at the moment, has he? Because they can't talk about free trade deals.
Not fair, really.
Well, sorry, I mean, I don't mean that he's not doing anything, but, you know, in terms of the role that he's been given, there isn't that much to do while they have to wait.
I think he's got to look at the existing free trade deals that the UK has as a membership through its membership of the EU and try to grandfather those across once we're out.
So how would you deal with the Boeing Bombardier dispute that we are now in the middle of? I mean, if it's going to be a great sort of panacea, this idea of striking up free trade deals, here we are coming up against a problem of protectionism.
Sure, and I think that does need to be resolved, and it's a question between Bombardier, the Canada and the US, and the UK, obviously, Northern Ireland in particular, is exposed to this, and we need to try and find a political solution.
All right, thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
The latest round of Brexit talks have ended with somewhat different interpretations of how they've gone. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, says there have been decisive steps forward. His EU counterpart, Michel Barnier, agreed that Theresa May's earlier keynote speech on Brexit had created a new dynamic. But he's still warning that it could be months before they're ready to discuss a future trade deal. From Brussels, Ben Wright reports.
The British minister's car is the same, a Jag, of course, but the tone of these Brexit talks has changed. A month ago it was fractious, frosty, the divides were wide. Today, reporting back on the week's negotiations, David Davis and his counterpart were conciliatory, and for the first time, Mr. Davis spoke first.
I believe that thanks to the constructive and determined manner in which both sides have conducted these negotiations, we're making decisive steps forward.
David and I, as well as our teams, worked well together.
Mr Barnier said the two sides managed to find clarity on some points, and it does seem the Prime Minister's speech in Florence last week has helped unblock the talks. Why? In part because she said the UK would honour the financial commitments it made as an EU member. It's one of the key three issues on the table, and it remains very contentious. The current EU budget period runs until the end of 2020, 2 years after we've left. The UK has said the other EU countries should not lose out financially, but Mr Barnier said the UK spending promises stretch further into the future.
Nous sommes loin du compte. Si on ne parle que de ces 2 années-là.
If you're only talking about 2 years, that's not the end, is it? The commitments entered into by the UK, while they were a member of the Union up to the time of their withdrawal, all those commitments will have to be honoured.
Protecting citizens' rights after Brexit remains another disagreement. The two sides seem closer, but the question of how EU citizens in the UK can pursue disputes is a stumbling block.
The UK has been clear that as a third country outside of the European Union, it would not be right for this role to be performed by the European Court of Justice.
But the EU is adamant that it should. The future of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is the third big issue being discussed now. David Davis said both sides were trying to find imaginative solutions, but it's not at all clear what those are. What's not being negotiated now is the future trade and security relationship between the UK and the EU. That's because the talks can only move on when the EU decides sufficient progress has been made, to the frustration of David Davis and his team. Monsieur Barnier, if I may, could you define more clearly for us, please, the phrase sufficient progress? It's very vague.
Il nous faudra plusieurs semaines, voire plusieurs mois.
It will take weeks or even months before we can say, yes, OK, there's been sufficient progress.
And so it may take months before we know what sufficient progress means. Despite today's step forward, this negotiation has many more hurdles to clear. The two negotiating teams will meet again in a fortnight. Before that, the Tory party will gather for its annual conference this weekend, and EU officials here will be watching that very closely to see what Theresa May and her cabinet have to say about the UK's long-term plans for Brexit.
Ben, thank you very much. Staying with Brexit, the government is hoping to run as efficient a border as possible when we leave the EU, without queues of lorries waiting to get through customs. Norway, which is not a member of the EU, has the largest EU frontier with European Union member Sweden. It's been called the most technologically advanced border in the world. So what could the UK learn from them? Our technology correspondent, Rory Kethlin-Jones, has been to find out.
It's 1,000 miles long and separates Norway from Sweden and the EU. And there are dozens of places to cross this border. From a motorway where you can choose to stop for a customs check, to country roads much like those crisscrossing the UK's border with Ireland, with, at least on the surface, the same lack of controls.
Well, that's what I call a frictionless border. Absolutely no checks whatsoever.
20 miles back in Norway, Tommy Olsen sets off with export goods bound for Sweden. He knows he won't have as smooth a crossing.
It takes a lot of time that sometimes we don't have.
Ahead at the border, Norwegian Customs has been investing in technology to make things smoother. A giant scanner X-rays lorries picked out for special attention. Here are some of the goods they've confiscated. With alcohol duties sky high in Norway, there's a constant battle against smugglers.
We can see all the cars crossing the borders.
Cameras on border roads big and small are connected to a number plate recognition system. In the future, they plan to connect this to the customs computers so that most lorries can be waved through.
The ambition is that a large proportion of the lorries passing here, where everything is okay, should pass without human contact, really.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
For now, drivers like Tommy still have to queue up and hand over plenty of paper, although he only needs to visit Swedish customs.
Now, Tommy is exporting from Norway and importing into Sweden, and at many borders that would mean visits to two separate customs operations. But because the Norwegians and the Swedes work closely together and have integrated their computer systems, he just has to go to one, the Swedish customs post.
Back at Norwegian customs, a queue of drivers arriving from Sweden is building up, and there's some impatience.
It's not fast enough, it's very slowly, so they could work harder and treat the customers better.
Sometimes it's very bad to come here because there's a lot of traffic.
This may feel like a busy border, but 10 times as many lorries cross the channel at Dover. So what's the Brexit advice to UK ministers?
With a hard border there, they have a big issue, because then you have to establish new facilities and you have to recruit a lot of people to deal with it.
So what would your advice be?
Make a deal.
Tommy's progress has been quite speedy, but Norway has a closer relationship with the EU than Britain is planning. Keeping the border traffic flowing may mean a big investment in technology and people. Rory Catlin-Jones, BBC News, Svinesund in Norway.
There could be months of wrangling before the EU is ready to open future trade talks with Britain. The EU's chief negotiator warned today that while some progress had been made in the latest round of talks, much more needed to be done. From Brussels, here's our Europe editor, James Mates.
Once a month now, the Union flag is brought out of the cupboard for the latest update on the Brexit talks. In August, it was peppered with verbal grape shot as the two sides spat accusations at each other. Today was a much more harmonious affair. The Prime Minister's speech in Florence and the concessions it contained have unlocked these talks, even if it's too early to speak of a breakthrough.
Thanks to the constructive and determined manner in which both sides have conducted these negotiations, we're making decisive steps forward. After 4 rounds, when I look across the full range of issues to do with our withdrawal from the EU, I'm clear we've made considerable progress on the issues that matter.
Money is the biggest sticking point. Britain's current position, yes, it will pay, no, it won't say how much.
But the UK will honour its commitments made during the period of our membership. We're not yet at the stage of specifying exactly what these commitments are. That will need to come later.
There are still disagreements over the rights of EU citizens post-Brexit and the Irish border, which means no start to those trade talks Britain desperately wants.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a constructive week, yes, but we are not yet there in terms of achieving sufficient progress. Further work is needed in the coming weeks and coming months.
Even before European leaders meet next month, the Parliament here will pass a resolution next week on the very day of Theresa May's speech to the Tory conference, saying that in their view, the sufficient progress threshold has not been reached. They meet again in a couple of weeks. A lot of issues are still to be thrashed out and tricky compromises sold to domestic audiences. But at least this time they walk away without everyone wondering if the whole process is about to collapse. James Mates, ITV News, Brussels.